And just to mention, for those of you who are just joining this one, there's been quite a series of very interesting topics ahead of this one that we're having. This actually is the 6th one. And the very first one was by Professor Salasinski, setting the scene of governance. We were all left enlightened, but equally confused, and not in exactly the same terms. I think this debate was also there when we were trying to rebrand the school as governance. And we see governance as the hub that is actually trying to channel the power to the wheel, but at the same time, it also wants to touch the tarmac. So something to think through. Then the next one was by Dr. Abrams, and the emphasis actually much more following on was we need to look at governance from different lenses, and she went basically to look at governance from a geographical perspective, which she cautioned all of us not to restrict to spatial. Then the third one from Professor McCandless was, to me, the main message there was that, and this is what I actually speak to here, we should actually define different indicators of what exactly we mean by governance, public policy development. And part of that, I think ultimately where governance is happening is the peace and security. And to me, that is what I thought really came through that particular paper. Then the next one was Professor Muller, and he actually sort of pointed out quite a number of particular items. And one of the things that came through was we can actually discuss governance without calling it good governance per se. And also to actually, I think this was also more or less setting the tone for the next paper, that economics is one of the components of development, but not the only one. And some politics around that was who sets governance rules for whose benefit. And the emphasis again from Professor Muller was that we actually have to set parameters that represent the values of society and level the playing field. The one last week was actually much more quite interesting, where economics received a thrashing from economists, and the view from Professor Pandya actually was much more that economics is one of the social sciences and should not treat itself as the social science. And the second message was quantification should not reign supreme, rather the aim and objectives of what we're doing should be that. And in continuation and with this particular backdrop, I actually sort of try to look at monitoring and evaluation as a governance intervention. Now, without getting ahead of myself, what I'm actually trying to put forward here is that just like any other development intervention, so is monitoring and evaluation. It is also equally just an intervention. Now, if monitoring and evaluation is also an intervention, it basically means that we require to monitor and evaluate it. If that's the case, how should it look like? And what questions should we start asking ourselves? So I present some questions at the end, and obviously taking advantage of the fact that we've been doing quite some monitoring and evaluation. I've got 4 items I want to share, or rather structure my presentation. The first one is on the naming, then the architecture of monitoring and evaluation. Then I look at the tool for tracking and assessing interventions. Then I I end up by actually saying, what if monitoring and evaluation is an intervention? What should it actually sort of look like? One of the things that has actually really fascinated me is, why should we actually have monitoring and evaluation rather actually having two names, monitoring and evaluation? Why didn't we actually, just like any other field of study, have a situation where we actually just have one name that embraces both aspects? And the reason is because you find that in monitoring and evaluation, we actually have to concentrate at one particular time, tracking an intervention, which is actually instantaneous and or rather continuous at any particular time. Then there is a question of assessing an intervention, and in that particular case, we're actually looking at it much more periodic. Now, if we look at it in that particular way, you actually discover that when we speak about monitoring, it is much more a management function, because any good manager presides over, one, the resources they have, which in monitoring and evaluation we call inputs. They preside over the activities of those resources, which is what we call activities. Then they actually account for their output, which is actually what we also still call outputs in monitoring and evaluation. Now, on the other hand, there is now been counting. Yes, you have produced these outputs. What changes are they leading to? And that's what we actually term as outcomes. And once we have the outcomes, does that change the lives of people that actually it's intended to go to? And that's what we actually say, we or rather name the impact of what we are actually trying to do. Now, within that discussion, I also need to bring in something that is quite debatable. Everyone sort of skates around it. Monitoring and evaluation is not exactly an academic field of study. It's a practitioner's tool. And that is why you never hear an equivalent of saying the study of monitoring and evaluation. You are going to hear more often than not where we actually talk about monitoring and evaluation practitioners. Related to that, I don't think this should actually be independent from the person that is being given the responsibility to drive an organization. Because two things happen. It's that person's responsibility to plan what needs to be done, as well as to actually track those plans, as well as to assess that they are delivering the correct outcomes and they have the intended impact on the people that we actually have. So in future, we want to see that integrated type of monitoring and evaluation happening in most organizations. Then, when we move to the architecture of monitoring and evaluation, and I think this is where we spend quite some time, and I'm quite grateful for my colleagues who are in practice, mostly in South African government departments, because for those that came earlier, actually might actually be very annoyed with me, because this has changed a lot of times. Monitoring and evaluation is one of those fields that is easy to understand in English, but challenging to execute. What you're seeing in front of you are actually some of the words that come when you are defining monitoring and evaluation. On the left-hand side, those are actually the contextual terms, implying that those are actually the terms that sort of you have to look in monitoring and evaluation with that particular view. Its development, its design, its management, its effectiveness, etc., etc. Then on the right-hand side, we actually have what I call the key terms, you can't define this without actually talking about monitoring and evaluation. So our idea was to try and actually link all these words together and hopefully come up with how we can nest monitoring and evaluation in what it does. And we started with the broadest term possible from the words that you have here, and ended up with every word that actually is here. And that's how we came up with this, which I actually call the Google map of monitoring and evaluation. And as you can see, the broadest term was actually development. And the good part, when you look at development, it's actually what we monitor and evaluate. However, it makes much more sense if we can attempt to try and narrow down development. And it's for that reason that we actually put it in components. So we have 5 of them, which literature could support: cultural, political, economic, social, and environmental development. Now, other than the components, we also try to look at the processes in development. And unfortunately, you find most of these in textbooks called international development, meaning that they're written by people that hope it's meant for others rather than themselves. And we found that there's the development that is intended, and there's one that is unintended, which to us was exciting, because when we study evaluation, we also have to hold back other factors other than the ones we want to evaluate. And that's how we divided it into eminent, which is what we plan for, hence the word development intervention. So this is planned for in the boardroom. But on the other hand, we've actually got ineminent, which is not planned for. Quick example, we do not plan for the guy that comes to clean your screen when you stop at the traffic lights. But is it happening? Yes, it is. Is it development? It's very difficult to tell. Now, development does provide the what we actually do. And the most interesting thing is that even if we actually strive to monitor and evaluate development intervention, it was rarely used in any of the credible development textbooks. So in short, I don't think development has the same relationship with monitoring and evaluation like monitoring and evaluation has with development. Then there was a matter of, because it's a process always talks about the how you actually do things. And we came to find that mostly in public policy literature, which by now we came to actually appreciate that it's at 3 levels. We've got the policy level, we've got the programming level, and we've got the project level. So on the side there, I was actually trying to also tease out what is already provided for. We know that we've got a field of study called public policy, one of the old and well-established fields of study, I should say. Then we've also got a lot of courses on program and project management, which in most cases we actually include monitoring and evaluation. What was interesting was the elusiveness of us trying to ground what we call in components of public policy. And in fact, this is one of the parts that actually changed over time because we just couldn't get it in literature until we actually came to decode that if you're going to do anything, you definitely need leadership. Then you need systems governance, you need resources and their management thereof, which is the political economy, and you need institutional arrangements. So this is much more cross organizations. In South Africa, we can refer that to the 3 spheres of government. We can also look at the relationship between the judiciary, executive, and the legislature. Then there's the organization arrangements, which is actually much more to look at individual organizations such as department. What's very clear in public policy, and I think this one is not missed, is the processes. Public policy as one of the social sciences has always actually had a large proportion of its syllabi on research, followed by decision making, and then the public policy cycle. And I reduced the public policy cycle from what is in the textbooks to something that actually sort of took place. We had the diagnostic reports, if you recall very well, in June 2011. Then we had the development plan on 11th November 2011. And where we've actually got stuck is how is that development plan actually being implemented? Then at the end, we've got actually the summative evaluation. Now, what you have at the bottom there is actually to correspond with what we need, and I'll speak to that later on. But the point I also want to make is that if there's any field of study that actually now starts to mention monitoring and evaluation more prominently, it's actually public policy. It's the monitoring and evaluation has got such a strong emphasis in public policy. And at the same time, I need to differentiate two particular aspects. Whilst development talks about what, public policy talks about the how. Now, it's in that thought that I want you to start thinking about performance. The word performance, does it describe the what, or it actually describes the how? I think the latter is much more close. It actually describes the how rather than much more to do with the what. Now, if that's the case, what does it mean when we said that the ministers were going to sign performance contracts? Were those performance contracts actually looking at what the ministers were doing or how they were doing it? And I think that's one of the debates that I want to throw to you later on. Then, as you can see, under implementation, we have management actually alongside monitoring. So I've always wondered why it's actually not much more management and monitoring, but rather we opted to marry off monitoring to evaluation. This is just to also highlight the three perspectives to break down the forms of evaluation when you're actually looking at an intervention. There's the formative evaluation that tries to address the question of will it work? And as you can tell, this is a futuristic, meaning that it's not yet out there, but we want to be very certain that this will work as soon as we roll it out. I've always wondered why electronic goods, all of them are tested before they actually rolled out, and that's why you find a sticker, a round sticker written QC, quality control. But that's not what we can say about interventions, especially on our continent. Then there's a second one, which is process evaluation, that has got more or less a present tense. Is it working? And that one is now saying that the intervention is already actually being rolled out, but you want to see if it's working the way you had planned it to do, to actually do. And the last one, which has found a lot of emphasis, is actually summative evaluation, which practically looks, did it work? So that is now in the past tense. So you had an intervention which you planned, and hopefully you did quite some interrogation to get the formative evaluation done on it. Then you, as you were implementing that particular intervention, you kept checking if it's actually on the right path. So you see a very close relationship between process evaluation, management, and monitoring. Then lastly, the summative evaluation. Please don't mind the figures. Those are for a later paper where we would like to model this. Now, monitoring and evaluation has got tools for tracking and assessing interventions. And it's basically three of them. The theory of change. Anyone who graduates in monitoring and evaluation should at least know these three terminologies that are here, which is the theory of change, which is basically the pathway of change. Like anything in life, there's so many ways of actually doing interventions. So the question is, which one is it that you're going to take? So it's one of those terminologies that seems to sort of evade even people who've probably written about it. But I've always simplified it to actually say it's a relationship that explains the if, then, because, to give you the theory of change. Now, of importance and arising out of the theory of change is what we call the results chain, as well as the results framework. It's more replacing the words log frame in the old terminology. And what it does, the next slide, it's not meant for you to read everything because it's not actually quite clear, but it's all just demonstrating that the results chain tries to tie up the inputs to the activities, to the outputs, to the outcomes, and to the impact. So in short, what you're saying is that if this is what you are aiming for, these are the changes you want, and if that's the change you want, that's the product or service you should provide. If that's the product or service you should provide, then this should be the activities you should be doing to get to that product or service, and that's how much you need. My colleagues from finance and budgeting will know that this is where the whole notion of zero budgeting came from. It's not that there is no figure on a zero budget. It's a budget that is actually saying what you want to achieve and how much, rather than here's the money, what do we do with it, which is actually basically the traditional way that this was actually done. Now, alongside this, and much more an improvement on the logical framework, comes the results framework. And here what we're actually gunning for is to have indicators for each one of these five. And coming with indicators are the data sources. If there's anything that one cannot do as a monitoring and evaluation person is to live without data. And that actually makes it an expensive exercise on its own. Now, the very first data point on an intervention is what we call the baseline. Now, the baseline, because we're planning, we actually have to have the target values. Now, with the target values comes the assumptions. What is it that should actually be present for anything to happen, as well as the risks. What is it that should not be present for that to actually happen? Once we have this, then you actually rest assured as a monitoring and evaluation person that this is actually going to work. In fact, it looks slightly more than that in the actual sense. Now, if monitoring and evaluation was an intervention, it would also require a results chain. It would also require a theory of change. So the question I'm posing to you is that how would that actually look like? What would be the impact of a monitoring and evaluation intervention? What should be the outcome? What should be the product? So far, that is not as defined, but when we actually think through the literature and try to piece something together, I think the impact of monitoring and evaluating is actually that you want governance. And that technically means that the immediate outcomes to that is improved service delivery, accountability, and transparency. And at the second level, as you can see, it's actually much more on improved and sustained decision-making, evidence-based decision-making, and on the other side, it's actually oversight. Now, the outputs should basically be mechanisms for integrating monitoring and evaluation results in planning, and on the other side, it's actually in implementation. What will be the activities? Obviously, it is good quality and consistent monitoring and evaluation. Now, this is where the governance aspect comes in. And the question I want to pose is that, yes, it's become very amplified, more notably in South Africa, Ghana, Kenya, Uganda. I think now we are adding Benin to the list of actually trying to promote mostly monitoring and evaluation. So why are we doing it? Are we doing it for any other reason rather than good governance? If that's the case, then are we actually complying, and are we actually seeing our governance improve as we actually improve with the way we look at monitoring and evaluation? So it is something that I can't answer now, but I start to actually say, let's look at the monitoring, the government-wide monitoring and evaluation policy. It is a monitoring and evaluation system, well, a framework providing the system for. And according to, even if it doesn't come out as clear in the document, but the reason why the ANC government wanted the government-wide monitoring and evaluation was because of poor service delivery in municipalities. So the question is, why do we have a national solution to a local problem? And my colleagues will agree with me that the emphasis of the government-wide monitoring and evaluation intervention is actually results-based, which is largely on the summative evaluation aspect of it. Now, why are we emphasizing outcomes when clearly the problem is service delivery, which has a process evaluation connotation? Because we can't evaluate the life of a South African if we have not actually delivered the toilets that should have been delivered and which have been promised and not yet delivered. So the intention was there for a good reason, and that is where now the statement, which is very notable in the media and elsewhere, we've got good policies, the problem is implementation. Now, if we have to fix implementation, it means that we're actually looking at the process evaluation rather than the summative. We can't start bean counting before we actually get this going. Then, related to that, are a few systematic aspects. Is it possible that the current department of monitoring and evaluation is actually much more the management than the governance too? Why do I say that? Because it's sitting in the executive who are supposed to be monitored and evaluated. So if they are using it as a management tool, then they are concentrating on what they are doing, and then who is actually checking how they are doing it. Because clearly, if we want to use monitoring and evaluation, then maybe we should be relocating this into the Chapter 9 institutions rather than as part of the executive sitting in the presidency. Then last but not least, we have a government that is actually more or less driven by the Roman statute. The Roman statute provides for don't make mistakes, and yet monitoring and evaluation is a learning tool, meaning that you have to make mistakes before you get it right. But are we doing that? Could that explain why a lot of thousands of rands have been spent on evaluations that have actually been embargoed because the public shouldn't know this is what's happening? In that particular case, it all compromises the whole aspect of governance. Thank you so much, colleagues, for listening to me. I see we have quite a lot of time for questions and answers. Thank you. Samantha?
Thanks so much. So Wow. The two questions that are there are basically for your presentations. So I'm just opening up the floor to colleagues. If anybody has questions, if you can either raise your hands or type it in the Q&A function. So someone wants to know, sorry, Sakere wants to know, through the theory of change, the interventions such as the RDP in the context of South Africa, which one would you see as an evaluation approach and why? A, empowerment evaluation, B, utilization focused evaluation, and C, responsive evaluation.
Okay, maybe let's just actually begin by looking at the RDP as an intervention to begin with. Is that the intervention that we can actually claim to be effective for what we needed, the change that we need in our communities? That's a question that I've always asked over and over ever since I was given a chance to actually be part of the process of trying to figure out, at least in just this particular province, how we can have monitoring and evaluation married to the IDPs. And my answer is that there are a lot of things that are missing. To begin with, most RDPs are not as contextualized as someone would want them to be. And why do I say that? They bring very good ideas, but most of those ideas do not speak to the immediate needs of the communities that they serve. That's the first. Second, the information in the IDPs is not probably the most ideal that you'd want to use for planning purposes, because what we have are actually numbers. They're not, like for example, we record the number of deaths, we record the number of births. What we need are rates with a denominator. That way we'll be able to tell what trajectory are we going, because even if we have 1,000 deaths this year, and there was 1,000 deaths 10 years earlier, we wouldn't know whether that is actually an improvement or not an improvement. Now, I would actually go much more on the, I think we need the empowerment, the empowerment evaluation. Why do I say that? We need to bring the community on board, at least to define the aspects that they think will actually change their lives much more than anything else.
Okay, thank you. Then there's a request for you to please re-explain the relationship between outcome and input indicators.
Outcome and impact?
Outcome and output indicators.
Oh, okay, yes. Okay, let's begin with just the results chain. The results chain comprises 5 main components. The first is input. So we start from the bottom. Ideally, we start from the top. So the inputs are basically the resources that you require to do any particular intervention. And if you have resources and you put them in the corner, they won't do anything unless you actually have also the human resource that makes those other resources, and that's what we call activities. Now, coming out of activities is actually something that is tangible, something you can see or feel. So it's either a service or a product. So if I actually give an example of, say, building a school, the simplest example I've always used in monitoring and evaluation is that at the end of the day, we should be able to see a building called a school, probably with teachers and textbooks. And that's what we call an output. So an output, by definition, it's something that comes out of the resources and efforts to actually build a tangible aspect of it. Now, You can have a school and no one turns up to learn. That can also be problematic in its own right, right? And I think we've heard terminologies such as the white elephant, etc., etc. I actually came to learn about another new term called the black elephant, but that's a story for another question. But the fact that learners will show up to come to that school which has been built, that is much more of an outcome. So there is change that has happened. A community has been given a school, and learners want to go to that particular school, and hopefully they sit in class for the duration of the time they need to be there. And that's what is actually an outcome. So it's the change that a product that has been averred brings to the community. Now, it's one thing, and I'm sure you've heard this debate before, it's one thing to actually sort of be educated, but if it doesn't change your life, then what's the point? And it's the impact that the education you attended because of the school that was built that we actually call the impact. Now, the indicators related to these two, and I'll restrict myself to the ones that you've pointed out, the outcome and the output, are obviously slightly different. The ones for the outputs are more or less bean counting. We provided 3 blocks of classrooms, right? However, the ones for outcome are much more with the behavioral change. People have started getting interested in coming to school. So the change indicators actually most of the time signify outcomes, whilst the product or service indicators are always actually the ones that we are able to visualize and be able to see this was provided or that wasn't provided.
Okay. Okay, so somebody has their hand up. I'm trying to get them to ask their question. Mallory, can you unmute yourself, please? Okay, while we try to figure that out, Annie has another question. What are the possible reasons for process implementations? Could it be that we plan wrongly, or? And should I read like maybe one more question, or do you want to do them individually?
I think let me go individually because I'm just mastering from what you're telling me.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, it is actually a big one, and I think that one also goes to some of the things that have been raised by my senior colleagues ahead of me. Why? Let me actually start by saying this. I mean, some of the things I've started appreciating when government says they are busy doing something, it is actually true that government is busy. But on the other hand, the community seems not to feel what they are busy doing. I have come up with an analogy where, and I got this from that time, the general tell when he said we'll fight fire with fire. I've come to start thinking that I think we're now living in a space where we have problems on the continent without solutions, but at the same time, we have so many solutions without problems. And it could be that what keeps government very busy is pursuing solutions that actually do not have the immediate problems of the communities whose lives they want to change. So we may be planning, but we're not contextualizing the plans that we want to roll out. What's this? It actually brings us back to the IDP. What's this? What amount of say do the people have in what they want to see? And I've seen this kind of push sometimes from the Western world where they want us to adopt what they're doing even before we get to that particular problem. And I know it's supposed to look futuristic, but if we're going to look at futuristic solutions at the expense of the current ones, that's going to be problematic. Yeah, I've got another analogy where I say when people want bicycles, you give them the how train. So you have to force them to ride the train. To force them to ride the train, then you bring the e-tolls. Then surprisingly, you find that they're already riding the train anyway. So what do you do with the e-tolls? Um, so my worry is that I think we have not incorporated as much as we should um, in our plans on what we should do. I mean, I look at 16th century England, where even just the discovery of oral dehydration salt was a big thing because they had just started to urbanize. But in our case, we have all these solutions, but moving faster than where our particular populations actually are. And that is compromising the implementation of some of these particular aspects. I mean, there are quite a number of examples in monitoring and evaluation that point to those particular aspects. And unless we actually sort of factor in our communities, it will be very difficult to implement what we actually currently do.
Okay, thank you. You can go ahead.
All right, thank you, Kimantha. My question is really more onto, I know that it's in a way imposed by the powers that be for government entities to currently be running after output, which is actually the numbers. But then my question is, how do we start to use monitoring to assess or to evaluate or to monitor the value add that's brought about partnerships that we go into, more especially there are so many partnerships that we enter into as South Africa with the outside countries like your China and on all those fancy stuff. But how do we really start monitoring the value add brought about by those partnerships?
Yes, that's actually a very important question. I think, and this has been habitual, where we have new ideas, which we are putting on old institutions. And as soon as you have a new idea and you don't change your institutions, then actually you are not doing as much as you should to address the problem that actually made you to think of that particular idea. If we're going to be having the value add to some of these interventions and relationships that we have to put the people first. And that's a very good concept that we have actually failed to really implement. What is it that the people actually need? Then track that. I'll go back to the example that I gave from Professor McCandless. Peace and security is one of the biggest indicators of actually development. Now, to that, I also want to actually add demographic indicators, my comfort zone. As long as you have a region or a country whose demographic parameters are compromised, then there is very little value add that you are doing as a government. So for example, this is how it goes. Mortality drops, followed by fertility, and migration stabilizes. In fact, it starts to attract immigrants, right? Now, if you have a situation, whether you're a country or a sub-country level, where people are going out rather than coming in, then there's no value add. And South Africa is a typical case of that. Yes, we've concentrated so much for good reasons on the immigration, the international one. But what about what we got from this, the mid-census, between census reports of saying that there's quite a number of people leaving other provinces coming into this province? What does that mean about the value add of provincial governments in those particular provinces when it actually comes to the development interventions that they are enacting, especially where you actually have provinces that seem to be much more richer or endowed with natural resources comparatively. So I think it comes back to the same thing, is that we need to, I don't think I can even say go back to the drawing board, because even the drawing board is broken. We need to actually rethink the whole aspect of how we have interventions and how we actually know which interventions are going to affect the people immediately, rather than do interventions that actually are imposed on us, either by our elites or by the West.
Okay, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, okay, yes, thanks, Governor. Yes, my question is as follows. Yes, if you try to see how the South African government actually went through their planning, all right? They started with a diagnostic report, and then from there, formulation was in place, and when they end up coming up with 9 challenges, all right? And then from there now, the issue had to do with implementation.
Yes.
And the target year was actually the plan that take us to 2030, all right?
Yes.
But so far, we have been shaken a bit with this COVID-19.
Yes.
No assessment. Is it realistic that that strategy will work, or everything has been shaken such that it will be difficult for us to implement that kind of national development plan of 2030? What's your assessment from that perspective?
Okay. Again, yeah, thank you. Very interesting question. One of the things that I really liked, and that's why I was even able to remember the exact dates on when the diagnostic reports came out and when the plan actually came out, was that I think there was some kind of concerted effort to get this to work. And I wouldn't blame any of my colleagues, probably in government, but I think there were some fundamental flaws in what we had intended to do, and it's something that I had actually shared on the invitation of the ANC caucus in this province. The first one is that we have eroded our foundation, and that foundation also is the foundation to development. The fact that we failed to integrate the cultural values of this society, something that Professor Mula also spoke to, is a very huge compromise on the aspects that we wanted to pursue in the development in the development plan. You recall in my presentation, I'd actually put 5 components of development. And the first one, and I put them deliberately in that way, was to start with culture and ending up with environmental. Why did I do that? Because the political systems depend on the cultural aspect of things. The Roman statute that we actually use for our governance is fundamentally still quite upheld in Europe, where we actually got it from. That's why we have the king and the queen, etc., etc. What about Shaka's fundamentals? Why haven't we incorporated them in our governance system? So to me, that was the very, very first mistake that we made. Second was that if you read between the lines of the development plan, it's clearly a top-down intervention. So I like the top because they always have the ideal from a global perspective. But I've never liked it when actually those ideals are at the expense of what you actually need on the ground. I'll give you an example. For corruption. I've asked this question over and over: is corruption an immoral aspect or actually an enforcement aspect? You see that the intervention goes for corruption as enforcement. Go to any prison and actually have a dialogue with prisoners, you are going to realize that they're more likely to repeat that no matter how many times they actually jailed. Now, that goes to show that we have forgotten to actually integrate the fundamentals of society in that particular development plan. So, with or without COVID, it was not going to attain much. In fact, whatever it was going to attain and we could have benefited was just going to be, as economists call it, trickle down of other people benefiting much more than the entire society. I mean, let's face it, with this we already know. One of the biggest problems we are actually, which underlies a lot of aspects, including corruption and crime in South Africa, are inequalities. When you have someone who can actually do whatever they want to do, and you have someone who's barely on their knees to survive, how much respect for human life do you think they can actually have? So the planning and the procedure for was the right thing to do, but the ingredients, I don't think were actually much more to the whole agenda of decolonization, transformation, etc.
Okay, thank you. Prof.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the response, okay?
Thank you. Prof.
Thank you.
Pillay wants to know, why is M&E being made to seem as if it's very complicated? As a cynic, I see this as an attempt to turn it into a science understood by only a small group of experts. Surely in the public sector, M&E should be understood and implemented by all policymakers.
I agree. I think, yeah, there's sort of been an attempt to try and actually make monitoring and evaluation that spatial. And I want to actually also use the words of Professor Pillay last week, that there's nothing really special about monitoring and evaluation. In fact, as societies, we've monitored and evaluated way before even the emphasis of monitoring and evaluation arrived to our continent. However, it is important to monitor and evaluate, except the function should be integrated within the people that are actually in management. In fact, to me, it is the DG and the DG's position to actually be able to plan, monitor, and evaluate the interventions under their institutions. It should not be separate. It has to be an integrated aspect rather than left alone to people that actually are being put in the corner office and sort of feared, like you've put it, because they seem more special than other people. No, they're not. In fact, in class, I'm on record to have actually said that it's the planner that is actually more important. When you do a monitoring and evaluation plan, you are responding to what the planner wants to do, not to how you want the planner to do things. And those are two different things. So yes, it's an important function, but it is just one of those functions that actually has to be done in an institution. And it should not be raised to make it look special, because it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be a tool that contributes to an intervention being executed in the correct way.
Okay. Let me see. So looking at the National Departments of M&E effectiveness, it feels like it is just a tick box exercise, no impact. Should it remain at national level based in Pretoria, be part of the executive, or be decentralized throughout the three spheres of government? Which one would be more effective?
Yeah, we need to rethink both institution and organization arrangements for monitoring and evaluation. To me, I'm actually thinking that the province should be tasked to be monitoring and evaluating the local government. So it should be out of the local government. Then we should move the national to actually be monitoring, to be doing the monitoring and evaluation for the provincial governments, then we need to now move the national to actually Chapter 9 institutions, either in the Auditor General, if the worst comes to the worst, even the Public Protector, to actually oversee not only what we are doing, but also how we are doing it. In the meantime, because it's part of management, it's like someone trying to referee their own game. And if we make it that way, it basically means that we choose what we let off, and we actually know what we keep a lead on. So it is true that at monitoring and evaluation, enormously, my colleagues have accepted, can be more effective than we are doing it. Otherwise, why do we have so many evaluation reports that are actually under embargo? What are they hiding? We want to learn so that we can improve. So if you hide those reports and yet cost millions of rands, then it's a problem. So we need to definitely rethink the monitoring and evaluation institution arrangements.
Okay, we've just got time for the two that's left. What have we been asked to report? We have been asked to report on the performance of new interventions, but there are no way of TOC or results chains or results framework, only targets for the MSTF. Where do I start as an M&E practitioner?
Perfect. My colleague Marcel will agree with me. One of the things we'll do year in, year out is actually we try to find a way of getting students to appreciate the theory of change, the problem tree, and then that follows obviously is a results chain with a results framework. And for some reason that just sort of was so difficult for most students. And then we realized that there has to be an element of actually systems thinking. So you find that if you actually want to have a very good monitoring and evaluation around the intervention that you have, by the way, most interventions in most countries come without being monitoring and evaluation ready. And it's our job to actually now reconfigure that intervention to be monitoring and evaluation ready. And that implies that you actually have to apply some systems thinking, as well as soft skills such as the problem tree or the theory of constraint. And once you actually tease that out, then you are likely to actually get several pathways. And it's from those pathways that you can now actually articulate what the theory of change could be. And the theory of change will definitely deliver the monitoring and evaluation results chain, to which you should attach the framework. And then you're actually going to be ready to do monitoring and evaluation. You literally put the aspects you should be doing at the end of probably a spreadsheet, and you know when to do what. And you find that that actually becomes much more easy to do.
Okay, and then we have, what is the focus in government? Why is the focus in government more on monitoring rather than evaluation? And why is evaluation not given the necessary attention? Is it not equally important?
I think monitoring comes naturally because it's a management tool. Think of it this way. When you jump into your car, you literally are responsible for the car. That's why in front of you is a dashboard. You have to see there's enough fuel, etc., etc. So because we've got no choice but to manage institutions, we are more or less in the driver's seat. So management comes naturally. But if you are driving aimlessly, you don't want to know where you're going, why you're going there, then you're obviously avoiding the monitoring aspect of it. And I think government has been avoiding that because obviously also on the emphasis of if you bring in the aspect of evaluation, then there'll also be the question of the how are you doing something. And human beings do not like to be evaluated, unless our students, of course. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think, yeah, that's all we have time for. So do you just want to wrap this up for us?
Yes. What I can actually just say is that we as a school, we've actually tried to redo our monitoring program to actually speak to what the monitoring is doing in the country, but at the same time, we're trying to play the advocates of what we think monitoring and evaluation should look like in the future. So we're not emphasizing, like other programs I know out there, the research part, which is basically evaluation. Neither are we actually trying to actually look at monitoring just as a management tool, but rather we're trying to look at monitoring and evaluation as a governance tool, something that we should do to the betterment of the society that we live in.
Okay, Dr. Wotela, thank you so much for your time for this amazing masterclass. For those of you who did request the presentation, I've got some of your email addresses. You can always let me know and we will send it to you. And we look forward to seeing you next week at the same time. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you, colleagues, for coming.